Good morning. It is 9:24 a.m. on Sunday, November 17th, 2019. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. How is it November 17th already? That seems improbable. But in any event, it's Sunday, and that means I'm continuing my rewatch of Cowboy Bebop with Session 9, jamming with Edward. As I said at the end of the recap last week, it always surprises me on a rewatch to realize how late into the season Edward shows up. Not quite halfway, but a third. And yeah, it just always surprises me. I mean, Edward is in the opening credits. Certainly, when I think back on the series as a whole, I remember Ed as one of the main members of the Bebop crew. But yeah, it's, sure enough, session 9. But here we are, and what a great episode that for Edward to finally show up in and join the crew. Um, I'm going to go ahead and refer to Edward with the she pronouns just because that's what they use in the show. But it's interesting to consider that if the show were being made today, would Ed have used the they them pronouns? Perhaps, certainly androgynous and frequently mistaken for a boy. Even we hear towards the end of this episode, even though Faye is the one that has interacted the most with Edward over video, once Edward is on the ship, expresses surprise. What? You're a girl? Yeah. And so, but on the Cowboy Bebop wiki, just in the background of Ed's, what was the origin of Ed's character? And apparently, originally, it was based on a description of the series' music creator, who was, quote, a little weird, cat-like, but a genius at creating music. I think a little weird and cat-like certainly tracks. But apparently, originally was going to be a dark-skinned boy, but then made a girl instead to basically balance out the gender ratio on the ship, because otherwise it's going to be a boy and then three, or I guess, so it would be three men, three males and one female in terms of the gender ratio to even it out. But at the same time, Edward is certainly not like a traditional girl, right? And in fact, the series director Shinichiro Watanabe has actually said in this quote, it's a translation, so the use of it might just be a translation relic. Usually we with non-binary, they them is more common, but there are all sorts of other pronouns as well. But basically saying its gender is meaningless, we don't need it, and I wanted to create a character that surpasses humanity. I personally think that he might not even be human, someone from outer space. And so the use of varying gender pronouns there, I think, is interesting. And almost certainly now that there's sort of more awareness of non-binary identities and different pronouns, it's interesting to consider how Edward might have been referred to if the show were made today. For that matter, they're making a movie version. I wonder what they'll do there. Probably the simplest is to just say she, but I don't know. It occurs to me I don't recall if I've noticed them announcing casting for Edward. I don't remember. Anyway, I could look that up, I suppose, but not today. In any event, let's talk about jamming with Edward, session 9. We start with an interesting and kind of ominous beginning where we see a satellite. What we learn is the artificial intelligence within a satellite talking about being lonely. And certainly the red light there is reminiscent of HAL 9000 from 2001, A Space Odyssey. But we see this satellite connect to other satellites and use these scary lasers to carve lines in the desert below. This is above Earth, which we see as very devastated on its surface because, of course, we also see, the broken moon in the background and all of the space junk surrounding that. And we learned a little bit about there having been a big gateway explosion in Sympathy with the Devil. But certainly now we're seeing that a lot of the remaining civilization on Earth has had to go underground because of the constant rock falls from the sky. But we see this desert being carved, and then as we pull back and see what they were making, we see these enormous, like, animal carvings that are very reminiscent of real world uh, archaeological phenomena. That's a weird way to put it, but real carvings in, that are, based on real things in the world. And in fact, as we learn later, the satellite recreated them, or attempted to, specifically because it missed them being there. And so, in any event, we see that happening. And then we meet Edward, who is lying out on sort of a rocky beach doing computer stuff, but just kind of out in the sun, and already making a first impression as being, well, that seems strange. What's going on there? And we see her hanging on to, hacking into various information for the Earth transportation gate, and seems delighted to realize that the Bebop is scheduled to be there on vacation. So we learn right away that she's paying attention to the Bebop and seems to have affection for it for reasons that are not yet clear. But then she's hearing about the rock showers, and we see one hit near enough by that it tosses her kind of into the air, and she's okay. But it's again, it's sort of just showing us that, hey, there's danger being up on the surface like she is. And in the meantime, we go back up to the Bebop, and there is a fantastic sequence of everyone on the Bebop really just kind of having a lazy morning. We have, Jet is working on his bonsai tree, Faye's filing her nails, Spike's washing his ship, and it's only Ein who is actually paying attention to the news broadcast, which I think is interesting. It's always nice to have those reminders for the show that, paying attention, that Ein, while he is a dog, also is really smart. And so the idea that he's paying attention, he's watching the news, is kind of fun. And then he's the only one really paying attention. And we're learning about these carvings that we saw at the beginning of the episode. But then there's a fantastic transition where the news broadcast kind of casually segues to, and Earth Police have offered an $8 million Wulong bounty for the culprit. And then you just see all of the other members of the Bebop crew like, oh? And so naturally we're going to have, the Bebop wants to get that bounty, but not Spike. He decides, you know what, chasing hackers is boring. He's not on board with this. He doesn't care. So he bows that one out. And so we have Jet and Faye deciding that they're going to try to to catch this culprit. And Faye speculates on, sort of nerd hacker stereotypes, about, that's who it's going to be, implying that it's easy as a result. And so in the meantime, we also have Ed down in some sort of it seems like it's Ed's kind of just squatting in some, like, abandoned building. There's a whole bunch of junk there. It's not clear that anyone else is in the area, but we see Ed kind of using a little remote control to fly a drone around, and then police come in. Radical Edward, we're here to arrest you. And then she hacks into their ship and starts flying it around like the toy drone. It's a fun sequence, although it's a little bit of there. It's not clear because they've come to arrest Radical Edward with guns drawn, and then she takes control of their ship and crashes it, not while they're on board, but then nothing else happens. It's not, so it's a little bit unclear why, like, is she not arrested or something at that point? Now, it could also be, we could imagine, like, they assume they must have the wrong person or something like that, but the episode doesn't explain that. So it's a fun sequence, except it just doesn't connect to anything else. Like, it's, it needs to happen for us to understand what's happening later at the end of the episode, but it's, we don't really have any sort of resolution for that scene, because it finishes with the police going, "Oh no, our ship is blown up." But then what, right? We don't see them again. We don't see Ed in custody or anything like that. But it's still fun. And so in the meantime, um, we get another fun sequence where she hacks into the Bebop and is looking around at their ship information, and we see her little smiley avatar on the screen looking at various parts of the screen, and nobody notices but Ein, who hops up to bark and growl at the computer, and then like it's there, and it's clearly looking back at each other, and that's kind of fun. In the meantime, we have Jet and Faye on the case, right? Jet learns that everybody in the area there thinks that the culprit must be this famous hacker named Radical Edward. And yet nobody knows who Radical Edward is. There's speculation is like, oh, a 7 foot tall person, drag queen, a 3-year-old kid, and nobody knows. We know now, but the point is that Radical Edward as a hacking persona is totally anonymous. People don't know at all. In the meantime, though, we have, let's see, Faye realizing that there are like tons of transmitters in the area, and so it's not making any progress at all. But we know, because we're also following Ed, that Radical Edward is not the culprit for this, but instead is interested themselves in it, especially because the Bebop has come and is looking for that bounty. So it's like, oh, well, I'll do that too, because, we know by the end that Edward wants to become part of the crew. So starts looking into it, finds out that there is no hacker, that the satellite instead has actually become uh, uh, become self-aware, essentially, and that it was lonely and it decided to recreate the Nazca lines, and so that's kind of fun. It's also, more of the, introducing her sort of playful silliness, where it describes itself as the central processing unit on the D135 artificial satellite, and Edward decides to call it MPU because it's like CPU, only neater. Sure. MPU, not even MPU, but just MPU. And so uh, Edward is asking, like, can I draw something? Which is a fun setup for the end of the episode. But the Earth police jam her signal, so she's not able to communicate with them. So at this point, this is why we need to have Edward finally make official contact with the Bebop. So I want to briefly cover that while Jet is looking at all of the different, trying to find Radical Edward, he does buy some candy from a kid there. And according to the wiki, these are piocos, a snack and claimed specialty of Earth. Um, but apparently there is in Japan a type of candy called hiyoko, and they are sponge cake candy. And I mention that mostly only because they are brown as depicted in the animation, and so we could imagine that they're chocolate. And so when one is fed to Ein and he eats it, I know that my sort of dog owner senses went, "Whoop! Are you giving chocolate to a dog?" But no, they are sponge candy, just so anyone else who might have wondered knows. In any event, and so that's it seems likely that in Japan, where that's a more popular type of candy, they would be more likely to have recognized what they were. But so we have at this point, let's see, everyone's kind of connecting their, comparing notes. But then this is where Edward starts talking to them on their screen, and they comment on like, this is just like a TV. It's not two-way. But she's talking to them through it. Obviously, a real-time hack job, according to Jet. Nice terminology there. But at this point, she tells them, here's what you need to do. You need to approach this satellite, disable its transmitters, and then make a physical copy of it. Uh, but you have to be able to approach it without using your computer, or else all of the other war satellites will burn you up with lasers. And it sounds impossible, but at this point, Spike is like, oh, hey, well, now I'm interested. And so we have this whole sequence here, and I think that this particular action sequence is better in concept than in execution. It's a really neat idea, having to approach from a distance and not use the computers, and all of that's fun. And then the idea of all of these lasers, but I think in practice the lasers don't feel as scary as they should, because there's not, we only see one brief section of like the, Spike's ship get hit, but it doesn't seem to damage it in any appreciable way. And they're all kind of just flying around going, and it's like, the sense of danger is off. It's not a big complaint, but it's just sort of like, it sounds cooler than it actually feels watching it. But that's fine. It's just an action sequence to kind of justify it being difficult to get to this thing. It is nice to have everybody kind of working together and contributing their own bit, because of course we have, Jet continuing to, run things from the Bebop, and then Faye having to come on her ship to kind of provide cover while Spike gets close, and he, does the spacewalk to get out and make the copy. Meanwhile, Ed's doing the computer stuff from from the surface. So everyone working together is great. Like, all the pieces are there. I think it's really just that the lasers feel too chaotic. There's not a sense that they're actually a real threat. They feel kind of like they're just shooting off wherever. But that's fine. And so in any event, what happens when Spike manages to make the connection to the satellite is that Edward basically says, don't worry, MPU, we're going to make a copy of you for them to turn into the police. Whereas you can actually be, safe and free, because they're going to destroy you otherwise, but this way you can survive. Now, I don't think we ever see MPU again, this copy that Ed makes, but all right. But in any event, it's a success. We have, there's a hilarious shot of the police listening to this news broadcast of like, oh, turns out it wasn't a hacker at all, it was the satellite. And then we kind of pan up to Spike and Jet looking eager as they have handed over this computer disk to the police, and they're like, $8 million Wulong, huh? Right? And it's just a really fun shot. That they look really happy, and it's nice. And so it's implied that they're going to get the bounty, but then as they're flying away, it's like, oh no, the Earth police have ruled that they only will pay bounties on human beings and not computer programs. Oh well, poor Bebop, snaked out of a bounty again. But in the meantime, during that whole process of setup, Edward is offering, hey, I'll help you. I'll tell you what's going on, but you have to do me a favor. And at this point, Faye's the only one there still listening, and just says, oh yeah, sure, totally. We'll totally do you that favor. And, she's just saying it because, especially later, when they're getting ready to leave, Ed's like, you promised. And Faye is insistent. Promises were made to be broken. But at this point, Ed manages to use their remote control again and control the Bebop to... There's a fantastic shot of Ed standing there on the rocks with the Bebop looming ever larger as she pilots it down to land right in front of her. And because, of course, what does she want as her favor? She wants to become an official member of the Bebop crew. Yay! Fantastic. We love it. Edward is great. She's such a fun part of the show. Um, Certainly one of the most memorable characters in a crew of memorable characters. And yeah, I'm very glad to have Ed on the show, and it's a fun episode as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. But next week, I may, you know what? I think next week I'm taking a break from the rewatch just because I will be away from home. I'm traveling next week to Colorado for Thanksgiving week. And so the following Sunday, I will be back to talk about session 10, Ganymede Elegy. So in the meantime, I'll talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes.